Okay, so Susanna, you are a social psychologist and you focus on leadership. How
Yes.
did you become inspired by leaders? And can you talk about a time that leadership has played a key role in your life?
I remember when I was in high school. So I
Hmm.
had a big poster of Lenny Kravitz, who I still have a crush on still now. And I remember having a little thing that I picked up somewhere that said leadership, who's gonna do it or something. So I think it has been in my mind for a long time.
Hmm.
Then I spent the first part of my career in leadership roles in the nonprofit sector in Canada. And so I learned, I mean, I had a business undergrad, but I really learned, I think, in that experience. And I think that was really when I saw that leadership is a spectrum, that there can be great leaders and there can be less great leaders and everything in between. And then eventually I was so obsessed with the topic that I went to do a PhD in in organizational behavior.
There are so many personality tests on the internet. I think the one that I heard about first when I moved to LA was Myers-Briggs, but there's a ton of different ones now. How do you determine somebody's leadership style?
I used to love Myers-Briggs as well, and I still use it. And I think it's good just to know the introvert extrovert part. I think especially when we live in a world where extroverts are so sort of put on a pedestal, and if someone is more of an introvert, it's harder to know where to place yourself. The way I usually assess people, and I do this in my leadership retreats as well, and when I coach people, is actually I ask them to do a highly sensitive person test first, because I think it's really important in this day and age to understand that, because highly sensitive people and highly sensitive leaders have unique gifts.
Wait, I'm so curious about a highly sensitive person. From what I know, a highly sensitive person can be, it's not just emotional, but like audio levels affect them more, smells can affect them more. What is it? What do you see it as?
Yeah. So I've come to understand in the last few years as much deeper than that. So, and I now understand myself as a highly sensitive person after taking the test and understanding it. Essentially, I think those of us that are sort of like highly sensitive is we pick up on way more than the obvious. So I used to think everybody noticed what I noticed. That means people's emotions. That means a certain like change in someone's energy level or something of that nature. And then when I came to understand this concept, I now know that's not the case.
Hmm.
And those of us that are highly sensitive can be incredible leaders. And, to be honest, having that gift is really useful for me in my research, because I'm a qualitative researcher and I do interviews. So I always have to read between the lines in a way you do as well. So there's certain gifts, but the flip side of it is that we're always picking up on a lot of information. And so if we don't find ways to organize that information or sometimes protect ourselves literally in that, it can be really daunting and it can be exhausting.
If you determine a leader's leadership style and then you test their employees and their personalities clash, is there ever a way to work in harmony or does somebody need to find a new job?
Of course, there's a way to work in harmony. I think part of it is just like any relationship, right? The love languages, right? So it's kind of like when you understand someone's love language, you know how to interact with them and you know how to make them feel good, even if it's not your thing of feeling good. I think everything comes down to understanding the other person and understanding that we're not all the same.
So, one of the things I was really interested to learn is that you have also been a yoga teacher for 20 years, which now makes sense that you're a highly sensitive person and your leadership retreats incorporate yoga. So, what have you learned about the importance between the connection of the mind and the body?
So I started Queen Bee Retreats in 2019 with the idea of sort of integrating everything I have learned and all the things I wish I knew when I was in formal leadership roles. And today cannot think of a way that the two are not connected. So much of leadership is just holding space for the group or for other people. But think about where you have to be internally to hold space for others and make them feel safe, right? So you need to have your outlets. You need to be able to connect with your body and even understand what's going on in your body to be able to be fully present and set the space. I mean, for example, like in preparation for our call just now, I was just sitting here literally going through my chakras, putting my grounding cord. Like I really, because I want to show up as as my full self. And I think a lot of leadership is like that too.
That's cool to hear. I think that through your work, you've obviously ended up interviewing a lot of employees. What are the top three complaints you hear about their jobs?
Yeah, great question. I hear a lot because some of what I focus on is toxic founder run organizations. That's some of my research.
We're gonna get into that.
Yeah. I'll tell you, the number one thing I think I hear is people feeling like they can't express themselves fully and show up as their full selves, and that it's not safe to be their full self, which obviously partially is related to psychological safety. But I think the other part is because a lot of the organizations I study are mission driven. And a lot of the time people say, I just want to show up and contribute to the mission and do my best, but the conditions in the organization are not set up for that. And so I just feel frustrated. And so what that means is then it stifles everything else, because it stifles people's creativity, right? It stifles everything. And yeah, I think the biggest thing is feeling safe.
What makes somebody feel safe at work, would you say?
I think it's different for everyone as a whole. But I think the leader of a team creates conditions so that people can express ideas, even if they feel like they might make a mistake or it might not be the right thing, or the leader might not like it or something like that. So I think it's about understanding, what do people need to not censor themselves, and showing people that they won't be punished if they do show up as their whole self.
That's interesting. So it's not just feeling like they can make mistakes, because that was the BuzzFeed model and it worked really well for a while. They gave people a ton of runway, all their creators. They said, just make shows. If they flop, they flop. But a lot of them turned into hits. But you're saying that you're allowing people to show up as their full selves. I think minorities and women have a hard time with that.
Yes. Ding, ding, ding. I don't know the full sort of spectrum or all the layers of the BuzzFeed model, but I understand exactly what you're saying. I think a lot of that has to do with breeding innovation, right? Like leaving space for innovation. And I think that is related to safety, but it's not exactly the same thing. You know, when we think about what happened over the pandemic, where so many people started to feel safer showing up as themselves, as you said, women, minorities, all kinds of other groups. And why was that? It's because people stopped giving a shit. Do you know, people were like, we're in this context where there are way more important things than following the corporate line or whatever it might be. And so people started feeling more free to be themselves. And it was very interesting because some leaders embraced that and encouraged that and were just like, you know, they were thriving themselves. They were happy to have their employees thrive. I equate leadership with parenting and with teaching. I think they're all the same thing in many ways, because what you are doing is showing up to be of service to the people to feel safe.
Are there types of bad bosses?
I think a bad boss is often someone who's in it for themselves, right? Like back to leadership, like back to the concept of, if we believe that leadership is being of service and creating a safe space, or just creating or holding space, then sometimes the bad bosses are the ones who not only don't hold space, but don't care too. Mm-hmm. And are not thinking like that at all.
What would you say the biggest distinction is between a good boss and a bad boss?
So the safety thing that we spoke about, I think would be definitely up there. I think another thing is someone showing up as fully human.
Does that mean like showing their own flaws?
Exactly. So I had a meeting recently with the professor I work very closely with at Oxford, and her and I we worked together for 6 or 7 years. So we do have a very quite open relationship. And the other day, literally this week, we had a call, and right as we entered the call, she was like, I just want you to know I'm fully drained. There's a situation, at the office right now. And it's like, I knew the context. And she was like, I just want you to know how I'm showing up right now. I'm like, I'm not at my full capacity. And she didn't have to share that with me. And I'm not saying that everyone has to, but what it did was, it made me, first of all, be empathic, but also be like, okay, got it. Like, I know what space we're in here.
What do you think is the difference between a good leader and a great leader?
I think the difference between a good leader and a great leader is, if beyond making people feel safe or making someone feel safe, they genuinely care about the person's trajectory and their growth, and are genuinely not just like a superficial mentor, but genuinely like, how can I make this person's path a little easier? What challenge can I give them, but a challenge that's going to be growth filled, that they're, that they're going to engage with? Do I really understand what their goals are? I think that's a critical one. When I coach people, I'm thinking of a couple of calls I had recently, a couple of coaching calls where their boss, who in one way had the best intentions, gave them a promotion that, without asking them, that they thought the person wanted because it would move them up higher or something, put them in a category in that corporation that he himself wanted, that he himself thought was great. And the person is like, but I didn't want it. That wasn't even a goal of mine. Like, in fact, this is stressful for me. In conversation with that person, I was like, why didn't he just ask you what really your goals are?
Yeah.
And then act accordingly.
So we're going to talk about toxic leadership in a bit, but I first want to talk about what great leadership means. Are there specific figures in politics and business and pop culture that really inspire you?
Yes, so many. Most of them are women. I would say, first of all, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, is incredible. I think what a great example of showing up whole, showing up as a real person, showing up as a whole woman, all the things. Like, since I was in high school, maybe even before, I've had two women that I really have always admired because of how they show up, which I also consider leadership. One is Sophia Loren, and one is Joni Mitchell. Both in their own spheres have showed up whole and unapologetically. I think the people I love, the leaders I admire, both show up unapologetically as themselves and are deeply compassionate for the people they work with.
Oh, you know what? I watched it on CNN. Yeah. Anderson Cooper was interviewing this woman who said, we focus too much on who somebody is once they're in a position and not who they were getting there, because she felt like in order to determine what type of leader someone will be, just look at how they led on their way there. Fascinating.
Yeah.
I have her, and I like Kamala Harris, but from all my friends in politics, her whole campaign to become VP was in the inside world of politics, had a lot of problems with her leadership style, which I found fascinating because you didn't see that publicly.
I have a few thoughts on what you heard on CNN. I agree with it to an extent. I think that people really grow.
Yes.
I think that's a really important thing. Like, I think that looking at I'll just speak for myself. If you look at myself in leadership roles a decade ago versus now, I am a different leader because I have done a lot of self-work and understanding of this. But I do think what you said is very, very important with relation to, it's like the same thing people say, that when you go on a date, look how the other person treats the people around them, right? The service staff or whoever. I don't know if you ever heard that.
Right. Well, I always ask like how they broke up with their last girlfriend.
Oh,
because it's usually how they're going to break up with you.
100%. And within that, how are they speaking about their ex, right? So to me, all of that is an extension of how are you treating people?
Yeah.
And I do think another measure is, are people keeping people in their lives after they've left a workplace? I'm not saying you have to be BFF, not at all.
Right. Did you burn the boats?
I mean, that would be, if you think about it, especially if you've been somewhere a while.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I'm not saying you have to be BFF with your boss or whatever it might be, but if you don't have any connections that are workplace connections from the past, I would say that's a thing to look at. To me, that is about sort of like showing up whole and showing up human.
As an employee, do you think there are red flags to look out for when you're interviewing at places? Because I think now more than ever, people are starting to feel like, okay, you're interviewing me, but I'm also interviewing you.
Yes.
When it comes to communication, leadership, what are things to look out for?
Because I have been so vocal for so long about bad bosses, in essence, and that we don't have to put up with toxic workplaces and all that, people that are close to me, I often, here's a text message I often get from someone. They're like, I'm interviewing for a job, and I thought about all the things you've ever said about like the person, and I'm trying to talk to people who work there, who have worked there, about the culture. And because that is one of the biggest things I always say is, if you can talk to someone who will talk to you honestly,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes even just find someone on LinkedIn if you don't know anyone.
Do you think it's okay to reach out to someone cold on LinkedIn who used to work there or who does work there?
I would, if you had a choice, I would go to someone who used to work there
Yeah,
first, because they have no, in theory, they shouldn't have any hidden agendas or anything, right? So they should be able to speak with you freely.
that's a good.
And if you know someone who does work there now, but can be honest with you, right? Like can really be like, here are the advantages, disadvantages, here's what it really is. But I think sometimes even from a website of an organization,
Right.
you can see who's being highlighted. What are they talking about? I think one of the hard things is there's such a buzz, you know, in general around values and organizations defining their values. And of course that's important, but it's not important if they're just using it as a tool to make you think that that's how the organization will be, and then something else happens internally.
But how can you tell the difference? I've been bamboozled a few times.
My advice around that is, if you've had the confirmation that it's not a place where you can thrive, or it's not a place where you can be comfortable, it doesn't necessarily pay to stick around and find out how bad it can get.
I fully agree. So at the end of every job interview, you typically get asked if you have any questions. What do you think are some smart questions for somebody to ask that is interviewing?
Well, what people want to see, like if you've ever been on the other side of the of interviewing people,
Yeah.
personally, I always wanted to see that someone had truly done their research about the organization. They are an interested person, and that they really want to know about the people and where the organization is going. So I think good questions are, what happens in the, you know, what are the plans for the next few years? The same way that they ask you, what are your plans for the next 5 years? You can ask, what are the organization's plans for the next 5 years? What, how do you see this role evolving? What kind of growth possibilities are
Mm-hmm.
here? Like, yeah, I love that you said earlier that people now are feeling empowered to think, oh, I'm interviewing them as well. I think the moment you get into that mindset, you know what questions to ask.
So I think most workplaces don't focus on training anymore. They used to in like the 50s and 60s. And they definitely don't train people to become good managers or good bosses or even really talk about leadership much. So, say you're an employee who really wants to learn what it takes. You want to be a great leader or a great manager one day. How can you learn to lead on your own?
Oh, that's a tough one, because leadership, we lead in relationship,
Mm,
right? It's kind of like, I'm not a parent yet. How can I learn to be a good parent? I think there are ways, books you can read, examples you can absorb, self-work. I think the best way to become a good leader
yeah.
is to deal with your shit, is to do your inner, I mean, that is a real truth.
Do you like any of the book? Like, do you like Simon Sinek? Do you like any of these kind of people? First of all, they're mostly men, which is interesting. But do you like any of these people online who share their philosophies on leadership?
Before I entered academia, before I formally started to study organizational behavior and all this stuff,
Yeah.
yes, I used to love all those people and look at all those people and read and watch all the TED Talks and all that. Simon Sinek speaks to entrepreneurs specifically, right? So his thing is start with why and whatever, which is a brilliant thing, but it's not the only thing. And sometimes we give way too much energy to that, right? And I think so much of good leadership, when we're talking about leadership, pre-entrepreneurship, like leadership as a whole, is in the nuances. It's not in the like one concept. Again, back to like, what makes someone a good parent, right? Like, it's not in one catchphrase. It's going to be in, you know, as Brene Brown would say, right? Are you showing up in the ring? Like, for example, That's a good leadership book, Dare to Lead. Her book that is about
Vulnerability.
exactly. It's about all her research. You know, she's obviously someone I really look up to. And one of the reasons I look up to her is she's a researcher who works actively to translate the information for the masses, but also shows up as a full human, right? She doesn't show up and say, I've mastered this. She shows up and says, here are the findings. I'm wrestling with it too, right? Like, here's what it is. Yeah, like, it's hard. I don't have like strong feelings on like, oh, this person, no, this person, yes. I just always think it's about so much more than that. If you don't have your tools and you haven't at least started to do your inner work, dealing with your shit, it's much harder to show up as a good leader for other people.
This made me laugh so hard when I read this. So in your work, you say that a red flag is if an organization calls themselves a family.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Why?
Yeah, I have a study right now that like we're calling, like, it's about entanglement. It's how people get entangled in these founder-run toxic organizations, which comes from my doctoral work. And this comes from that. And because I noticed, like, after, you know, studying this for 8 years, that in the most toxic places, they always have this thing, but we're a family, or the leader will from the beginning be like, you're in the family, da da da. Why that's dangerous is your workplace is not your family. You can feel warm feelings and obviously love your colleagues, but if someone comes in and the first thing you hear is, this is a family, I would either run right then or really take note of it, because it means someone is trying to bypass your intuition and your inner understanding of what is really happening.
Okay, that leads me to my next question, which is about love bombing, because it's a very common term in dating, but you say it's actually common in the workplace. So can you explain what that looks like?
Yeah. Love bombing is another term. So I have a co-author in Boston in the study, Bess Rouse, and she's at Boston College. And when last year, we were talking about what do we pull out, and I brought this love bombing idea to her. I was like, this is exactly what it is. Exactly what people are talking about in relationships is what it is. And so we started talking about how do we put an academic language, like, because it's too scary for academics to say that word. But it is very closely related to the family thing, because I'll tell you how it plays out in many organizations. It plays out through perks. So, right? Okay.
Like free kombucha on tap. The perks sometimes are what make work fun. So how can you recognize a toxic workplace? What does that even mean?
I think there's a difference between perks with a lowercase p and perks. And the difference is when you work in a workplace and they give you fun snacks, that's a perk with a lowercase p, right? Like, that makes it does make it fun. It makes it like, you know, I interviewed someone a few years ago, and I was like, so how long are you going to stay in this company? It was like a IT company, a tech company. And she was like, I mean, as long as the waffle guy is going to still be here every Monday, like, literally, I'm here for the food. Like, and she was half joking, but not really, you know? So that to me is a lowercase p.
Got it.
When you have perks that are sort of next level, here's a great example. Let's say someone starts taking note of something wrong in the organization or something wrong in the leadership. And the next day, that person gets $500 sent to them out of the blue. I have a case that I recently had this happen in. That's a red flag.
So bribery.
The bribery. Exactly. It's bribery, but like, right, like us on the outside listening to this are like, obviously this is problematic. But when you're on the inside and things are normalized, you have less of a reason to think something's wrong.
So what do you consider a toxic workplace?
I consider a toxic workplace, first of all, when nobody can be free themselves, like as in fully themselves and show up and express their opinion.
Okay.
I think the other one is when one person or a small group of people, so often the leader in their inner circle or the leader alone, has all the control in an organization. The other thing is, are people truly being rewarded for their work? Are they being seen for their expertise? Because in a lot of toxic workplaces that I study, everybody's achievements are downplayed if they're not the leader, if they're not the founder.
What do you think about thanking employees? I worked at a place one time where the leader never said thank you, and it was everybody's biggest gripe.
I think that sounds toxic to me. I mean, why would you, do you know what I mean? Like, you don't need to like give anyone anything. Why would you not say thank you?
I think his argument was, this is your job. Like, this is what we're paying you for.
It's interesting. I worked in a toxic workplace once where the founder said, we don't give praise. So something similar to what you're saying. And she made it about that this was a philosophy. And in truth, what it was a way to control and a way to downplay people's spark, you know, for lack of a, because think about, it's such a human thing just to say thank, just to be acknowledged. You don't need like a big, doesn't even have to be public, means the world. It just means that your contribution is valuable. And the moment that you stop doing that, or maybe that never existed, is when you as the employee stop recognizing your own worth. Like a lot of the people that I interview that come out of, that are in the trauma study, the biggest thing they talk about is confidence. That they say, being in that place shook my confidence, even though I came in very confident. And so then they start to, it's again, if you put it in the romantic context, if you've had all good relationships, then you had one abusive relationship, that fucks you up for the next one, right? Because you're just like, you start to doubt yourself, even though you didn't before you were there. It's
very interesting that this is so closely tied to relationships. It's very similar. So I've always felt, and this is baseless, but it's just a theory. I've always felt like there are 3 pillars when deciding if you like a job or you want to take a job. It's the people, the content of the work, and the pay. And if you get 2 out of 3, you're usually happy. I notice when it's 1 out of 3, that's when people start thinking of leaving.
People, content, and pay. It sounds on point. I think the only additional thing I would say is we all have different definitions of success. What is your own personal definition of success? Because everything else plays out from there. I think just asking yourself that question is really critical.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever asked myself that.
Yeah, I would I would sit with that for a bit, you know, and like give yourself some time with it.
Okay. Thanks for that, Susanna.
My pleasure.
So before we get into toxic workplaces, which I know is your bread and butter, so I don't want to skip over that, I have a devil's advocate question.
Sure.
And this is not, I want to preface this for everybody listening. This is not necessarily how I feel. It's just, I think, an interesting conversation. All workplaces are challenging in some ways. Are we expecting too much from work, or are we not expecting enough?
I love this question, and thank you for asking me. I really think it's an important question to ask. It makes me think, someone I was coaching a couple of years ago who was in the fashion industry for a long time, she said to me, how do I find tools so I can survive in yet another toxic workplace? Like in this toxic setting, once we understood that it was a toxic industry setting. And I said to her, but you don't have to. As in, it doesn't mean that every organization in this industry is going to make you feel that way, but she had never had any alternative experience. So her thing was, everything's going to be like this or challenging in that way. So I need to find tools to be okay in it. And it's not that that's not one way, but I don't think that's.
Well, and I'm now projecting because this is my personal experience.
Yeah.
But I found early on, like right out of college, people were way worse to me than later on in my career, like the last few years. And if I'm going to take some ownership over it, of course, there's like things I did or roles I've played. But I think when you're early on in your career, like you do need those tools if you want to make it in a certain industry. I was determined, like I wasn't going to leave TV. And so I pushed through a lot of these toxic workplaces.
I totally hear that. And I think that that is common in the sense of like, you chose an industry that you knew was going to be challenging, like I'm sure you were aware of some of the things before you stepped into it. And that, I can imagine, was less important to you, that like how you felt was less important to you than being in it, right? And just doing it.
But honestly, all of my friends, except for the ones that work in like nutrition or social work, where feelings are really important to their work, all have toxic workplace stories.
Honestly, I mean, it makes me really sad to hear that, but I also know it's the truth. It's the truth in terms of it's so common. When I think about this, I zoom out all the way. Like I think about what premise are our societies structured under? And North American society is extreme capitalism. And extreme capitalism doesn't care about humans. Like I remember being in business school in my undergrad, and I remember being in the first HR, or no, like I don't even know what class it was in, but they kept saying human resources. And I was like, I just thought they meant like a thing. Like I really didn't even understand what it was. And I remember like months in being like, are you talking about people? Like what? Like, why are we calling it that? Right. So when you deconstruct these concepts, of course, a lot of like the baseline or what we expect is like the human feelings and the human experience matters way less than the outcome or the money we're making or whatever. But I hope that today we're in a world where people are asking more questions. Like I do think, and there is a generational element of it, right? Like, you know, the whole thing of like boomers or older people, like not understanding why millennials want another week off or want freedom or whatever, right?
Well, the next generation now, the Gen Z thing is all about feelings. Like their bosses complain that they have so many feelings. And you're saying maybe it's not a bad thing.
I think it's not a bad thing. It's so interesting. It's like when you think of some of the older people or the people that have been in workplaces longer that have never been able to express their feelings or have never been able to like take a real sick day or whatever. And all of a sudden someone comes in and is like, yeah, I'm not feeling great. I'm taking the day off. What it happens is it puts a mirror to them and their whole experience. And that's scary. And people don't want to really reevaluate, like, oh my God, like who would I have been if I felt comfortable to take sick days, if I felt comfortable to do things. And I think, so, you know, I totally understand and agree that some industries are more toxic than others because that's what they're like, you know, kind of built on. But, you know, for example, even in, I don't know if it would be considered your world exactly, but like the whole Ellen DeGeneres thing.
That very much my world. And for years in LA, it was talked about in TV world. Like everybody knew that that was a toxic workplace, but when it broke, no one was surprised.
Well, so, and I heard that as well. After it went down, I started hearing like, oh, everyone knew. And that's what usually happens, by the way. Usually people in the world knew, but then I have many questions out of that. First of all, why was it not called out earlier? Second of all, is it that industry is just so comfortable with toxic workplaces?
Daytime television, Susanna? Holy shit.
I mean, I've heard you mention some of the things in some of your episodes.
No, it's wild, but it's also, I think, part of the culture of like the war stories. Like people love reminiscing over it also.
Sure. And here's another thing about workplace trauma.
Yeah.
And I have this in my interviews where, you know, people will say, yes, the workplace was toxic, but the people were amazing. And we got so close because we were like, sort of like banding against the same, you know, sort of like devils, so to speak. Yes, 100%. But when you put that in the context of like a toxic relationship or a toxic family, just because that's happening and because those are your survival mechanisms doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make it okay.
Toxic workplaces. There's been a lot of examples of founders that are men. Adam Newman from WeWork, Billy McFarland, which was the Firefest guy, in Good to Great, which is like a very popular leadership book. Jim Collins writes, less charismatic leaders often produce better long-term results than their more charismatic counterparts. That was fascinating to me. Is charisma a red flag?
Not necessarily is the short answer. Obviously in a lot of the founders I study, you know, including like Elizabeth Holmes, charisma is a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole story. So someone can be charismatic, but not abuse it in a way, right? It's like celebrities. It's a great example. You know, so many celebrities or so many actors, like that's just like what they do and they naturally have charisma. But we can, I'm sure, both think of examples of people who then abuse it.
Right. And those who don't.
And those who just are like, and it's interesting because I think on the other side, the ones that don't are conscious of its power, if that makes sense, right? Like, so someone could be understanding of the impact they have on people and keep it within the parameter. One of my biggest things is with founders, but I think with everybody, is let's take people off their pedestals, because we are all responsible for putting people. We bought the magazines with Elizabeth Holmes on the cover.
Yeah.
Where it said the next Steve Jobs or whatever. So if she was the other kind of leader, she would have said, don't put me on that pedestal. I know it's an interesting like way to think about it, but if you think of people, I'm sure you've had examples, like when you think of people who recognize their power they're having and they're saying, don't, you trust your own intuition.
It's like good parenting, right? It's like make your own decision. Here's I've guided you far enough. Make
Exactly.
your own.
First of all, I think parenting should come with a license.
Mm-hmm.
Did you do your trauma work? Do you even understand what this is?
Maybe being a CEO should also.
100%. Oh my God. I would love, that would be the greatest thing ever. Like, have you pass these tests, because good parents understand that they have a power.
Yep.
And they understand that sometimes they really need to use it. And sometimes it's not, you know, it's like hold yourself back kind of thing. And that takes a self-mastery, and it takes self-awareness. And I think leadership is the same. And I think the questions we're talking about are the same. It's like, are you self-aware? Having said that, the reason why I started these retreats for women, because I want women to feel like there's an alternative way of leading. And we don't have many examples of that right now. And my feeling is, and so far what it's proven to be true, is when we're in community with other women who also show up open-hearted, things do shift, and you start to think of, wait, I don't have to show up in just the masculine leadership way that we've all seen.
Two of my very favorite bosses have been women.
Yay.
And one recently was when I worked for IMDb. Her name is Lindsay Campbell. And watching her lead and just even maneuver and email and all the things, I don't even think she knows how impactful it was for me, because I had never seen, like, I don't email the way men email, right? And so like I had never been able to see that up close and personal. So the fact that you're giving people these examples and even like peer to peer is so valuable. It's so cool that you're doing that.
I just got chills in the back of my neck. I'm so glad that you have not one but two examples of that. Like, that's all we need. We just need proof that it's possible. And we need people, women, we need women to show up embodied. Men too, though. Do you know, like, it's just about the masculine, feminine, energetic balance, regardless of gender.
There's something about seeing yourself.
Yeah.
Like I've had good male bosses too, but I don't see myself as Steve. Yeah. I see myself as Lindsay.
Exactly. Back to why representation matters, but also why, like, you do have a responsibility, especially as a female leader, of how you're showing up, because the other people around you are paying attention. They are paying attention, even if it doesn't seem like it. And those thank yous matter. And that the way you write the email matters. And which, you know, to link it back to the earlier mention of the performative vulnerability, do you feel the difference, right? Like this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about that. We're talking about showing up embodied and just being honest about this moment.
Yeah.
And bringing your whole self to it.
So I learned about this recently on TikTok, and I'm so glad that the timing was right, because you are the perfect person to ask about it. So it's called the glass cliff. And I guess it's what happens when a company is in crisis and then they put a woman in a leadership position, and a lot of it's kind of having to do with virtue signaling. So it happened with Mary Barra at GM, Carly Fiorina at HP, Marissa Mayer at Yahoo. Elon Musk just announced that Linda Yaccarino is going to be the new CEO of Twitter. Is the glass cliff theory a myth, or is it real?
So I had not heard of it before, but it sounds about right to me. Unfortunately, it tracks. It makes me sad, you know. And it makes me sad for those women as well, right? Because like it sucks. They're not being set up for success. But I think what it speaks to is the reality of the current world we're still living in. Like, even though we're questioning some of these things, and when we spoke a moment ago about having the women in our lives that are the embodied leaders and show up in a different way, unfortunately, those are still few and far between. That is still not the norm, right? And so that it makes me, well, it makes me heartbroken, but I think it also speaks to those industries sometimes, because especially in a lot of like the tech industries, they still are the bro industries. And
Yeah, very much so.
So it kind of tracks. Yeah.
I remember when Uber was in trouble years ago, they did this press conference type thing and they had like Ariana Huffington as part of their board and all these women. And I think the issue was they had a rape charge that they didn't deal with properly. And then nothing ever happened. And there was no protocol put into place and nothing changed on the app to help women be safe. It was like all a bunch of BS.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the reason they can get away with it and have gotten away with it, and why it continues to, like, not a lot has changed in this industry and other similar industries, is because it's still men at the top.
Yeah.
And it's still a lot of white men at the top.
Yeah. The big reasons diversity really, really, really is valuable.
Huge. And then the people that do show up that aren't the white men, do they have space to push differences forward if they want to? And, like sometimes it seems like we've made such great progress, but then you hear these stories and it's like the moment I read that, the theory, I was like, I started thinking of all these other examples of it, which sucks.
Right. They were top of mind.
Yeah, they were.
We have some rapid fire.
Ready.
Okay. A communication strategy that you find really effective to harness in the workplace.
Well, this is a bit of a best practice that I think is like a wider one that I have learned from other people, but really to like speak from your own feelings, as in not here's what you did wrong, but here's how I felt when you did this thing, or here's how it made this group of people feel. Yeah, I think anything around that is usually effective.
Something simple everyone can do to make their own experience in the workplace better.
I think have your tools of how you ground yourself and come back to yourself. So sometimes it can be as simple as water, like making sure you always have water around. For some people, it's like, I need to always go for a walk at lunchtime.
Yeah.
Or like take a space out.
Okay, a book you've read that changed your life, something you think everybody should read.
Oh my God, so many. If I can just choose one, then it's Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Someone gifted me that book actually, and I haven't read it yet.
I highly recommend that you do, but you kind of have to be in the right mind space for it. It's short, but it's intense.
Okay, let me know when to stop.
Okay, stop.
What's something you wish people could see about you that they don't see at first glance?
Aww. Funny enough, I think it's that I'm an introvert. This is the thing, is that I always say, for people that don't know me, I always say, contrary to how it may appear, because people think that just if someone's warm and friendly and open, that means they're, that they're an extrovert, because we have our definitions, because introversion and extroversion is how you recharge. So I think that's one big thing. And I so appreciate that people that know me well know that really well and account for that. Yeah.
Honor that. The smartest decision you've ever made?
Bar none, moving to Barcelona, 100%.
Okay, well, I'm sure as an introvert, this took a lot out of you. I'm actually an introvert too. So go nap. Go have your siesta, even though you're in Toronto.
Thank you. I will,